Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Omar Khan. I'm the Chief Executive of TASO, the Center for Transforming Access and Student Outcomes in Higher Education. I believe you're all here for the webinar today to launch our report with the Staffordshire University on exploring approaches to tackling the ethnicity degree awarding gap. Before I begin, and as a few more of you join the webinar, I thought I'd go through some housekeeping first. As I've already said, this is a webinar format. That means that all cameras are off except for the presenters and you are muted. So you won't accidentally appear on the screen, but you also cannot speak in this format of Zoom. You can, however, and we welcome you to submit questions and questions through the Q&A function, and we will address these at the end. The chat function is not enabled, so if you have any questions, please ensure you use that Q&A function instead. If we don't get to your questions, and we do have quite a lot of people registered for this webinar today, so it's unlikely if you're all asking questions that we'll get to them all, but please do feel free to email TASO directly after the event or during it, and we'll do our best to respond to you. Please also enable closed captions, which are available should you wish to see them. There will also be a feedback survey sent after the event that we'd be grateful if you could complete so that we can continue to make our events as useful as possible. I didn't explain how to access the closed captions. If you don't know, you select the captions icon in the toolbar below. But before we begin the substance of the launch, to inform our discussion later, I've got two questions, a poll that we're about to pull up for you. Hopefully you can see that. And the two questions are, sorry, where have I got them? When are you planning to start writing your access and participation plan? And you've got some options there. Or if it's not yourself, perhaps when is your institution or organization, if you have one that is writing an access and participation plan. Obviously, if you don't need to answer this question. And the second is, to what extent do you agree that your institution or provider is designing interventions to successfully address the ethnicity degree awarding gap? And I'll leave another minute for you to answer those two questions, because there are around 150 of you on the call, so we'll just on the webinar, so we'll just wait a little bit longer. Okay, I think that's probably enough time for people to have answered that. As I said, we'll be circling back to these questions at the end of our presentation and panel discussion to reflect on what you said then and whether it has any implications for today's event, but also for the work going forward on tackling the ethnicity degree awarding gap. Okay, can we close that poll now? Thank you. Right. Yes, sorry, I see a question. Are we recording this webinar? And yes, we will be recording this webinar. So can I please have the next slide, though? So moving on to the substance of today's event, we've got a great panel. First, we have the team from Staffordshire University who conducted the research on behalf of TASO, and you will be hearing from all three members of that team. Dr. Sally Andrews, who's the Pedagogic Projects Development Manager at Staffordshire University, from Dr. Aranola Adefila, who's the Deputy Director at Staffordshire Center of Learning and Pedagogic Practice, and also Jamelia Stevenson, a student who participated in this research doing a MSc in the Foundations of Clinical Psychology. After their presentation, we'll move on to a panel discussion where we'll be joined by Dr. Ada Adege, who is the Associate Dean and University Lead for Equality, Diversity, and Inclusive Practice at Wolverhampton. Sorry, so just as an overview of the session, first, we're going to give you some introduction and context, including TASO's previous work in this area. Second, the project methodology and key findings, turning over to Staffordshire University, who will also go outline their recommendations. And finally, there'll be a panel discussion as outlined, followed by the Q&A. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd give a brief background, just three slides of background as to why TASO is conducting this research. I probably don't need to convince those of you on this call that there's a persistent and significant gap in the number of white students being awarded first 2-1 at undergraduate compared to Black, Asian, and minority ethnic students. The Office for Students and the higher education sector in general are committed to reducing this gap. Last year, TASO undertook a research project to investigate whether and how diversified curricula could address the gap through student engagement and satisfaction with modules. These findings were inconclusive, and they showed limited success of these approaches, but most notably that the interventions were not implemented as planned. So there was a gap between the intention of how those curricula were intended to be diversified and how they were then implemented in the classroom. The two providers that we work with have very interestingly since adapted their intervention following on from that finding. We sought, therefore, given those findings, to conduct an evidence review of the different approaches to tackling the gap. We knew that diversifying the curriculum or decolonizing the curriculum is one kind of intervention, but we wanted to do a scoping. We had initial discussions with our advisory group, an early scoping exercise that indicated that little to no evidence exists, and therefore a review would not be worthwhile of what works. Instead, we therefore sought to seek a better understanding of the different approaches being undertaken to tackle the degree awarding gap. That is, in addition to diversifying the curricula, what other kinds of interventions are being done on the ground by providers to help address this longstanding and persistent equality gap. Next slide, please. So we wanted to understand what different approaches or interventions exist and whether we could develop a typology of those broad approaches being undertaken to tackle that degree awarding a gap. As you see, we've commissioned Staffordshire University to carry out this research. We also wanted to understand whether those approaches or interventions differed across providers. For example, the size of their gap, their student body, or their size or specialism. We then sought to understand where there were clear theories of change and evaluation plans in place for these different approaches and level of evaluation going on. Did providers specify the intermediate outcomes, or what was the particular mechanism through which the intervention they were proposing would in fact improve outcomes for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic students? And finally, we wanted to develop an accompanying narrative and context to the typology through speaking to stakeholders. What institutional infrastructure supports delivering interventions? What prevents this work from being carried out effectively? And my final slide, one more before I hand over to the team at Staffordshire, is just to note, TASO is keen to continue to support the sector in evaluating building the evidence base on initiatives to reduce this gap. However, before moving on to full evaluation plans, we needed to understand the lay of the land of what's actually happening on the ground so that our support responds to the interventions that are actually happening in the sector. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback in both the room next door and on the mic, so I'm just apologies if it's a bit disruptive on your sound. So sorry, just to reiterate that point, TASO is keen to support the sector in evaluating building the evidence on initiatives to reduce the gap. But before we can move into the phase of designing evaluation for providers, we first needed to understand what was happening on the ground. We think that these findings are relevant for practitioners working within HE providers to implement approaches, and they should also be relevant to policymakers and indeed the regulator responsible for securing effective strategic change concerning this gap. We also want to encourage further research in the area, which is why the data will be available to download and via a dashboard on the TASO website. Sally is going to note this later in her presentation, and we're really keen and proud of this output, and thank Staffordshire for their work on it. The final note that I wanted to reiterate before I hand over to the team is that this is not a What Works report. TASO is a What Works center, of course, and we're seeking to find out what works in tackling inequalities across a range of matters. However, there is an evaluation cycle or an evidence cycle, and before you can address what works, we first need to understand the scope of a problem. We also need to understand what's happening on the ground. This project was intended to be at that sort of earlier phase to explore the current landscape of approaches to address the degree awarding gap. And therefore, we are not yet in a position to provide toolkits, guidance, and advice on which interventions you should deliver tomorrow. Our recommendations are, however, shaped around planning and evaluation and building theories of change. And to elaborate on all those findings and the recommendations, I'm now going to turn over to Dr. Sally Andrews, the project lead at Staffordshire University, to talk through both the methodology and the findings. Thank you.
Working on this project and talking to so many experts and people with experience doing this work. So to start with, I'm going to pass over to Arinola, who's going to introduce a little bit of the background of how we approach the foundations of this project. So Arinola.
Thank you very much, Sally. Hello to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. So when we started talking about this typology, we really want to ensure that we captured the context within which the APPs were speaking to the ethnicity awarding gap. And obviously, the first thing that you think about is, who are we talking about? So you would hear several different kinds of definitions around the degree awarding gap with respect to Black, minority, ethnic, Asian. You would hear all sorts of things around that. And what we were finding very, very quickly during the process was that it was very difficult to understand who we were referring to when we said BAME. And if Sally could go to the next slide, I would explain a little bit about how we thought about this. So first thing was that it became apparent that when we're thinking about awarding gaps, we need to think about the people. We need to think about the actual target groups and think about what marginalized ethnicities that they were coming from. The first thing to say or to note is that it's very difficult to use collective terminologies from people from such a diverse range of ethnicities and racialized groups. Obviously, we're talking about people from the whole of Asia, which is like 60% of the world's population, and obviously people from Latin America, African peoples, and all sorts of other people. And too many times when we use the word BAME, it is easily homogenizing these people. So it's very important to think about all these kinds of issues, especially within the context that you are working in. It's also very sometimes impractical to avoid using these shorthand terminologies. So we're not saying that it's impossible to use them. What we're basically saying is that we should have a sensitivity and understanding of what different people think about how the term refers to them, or probably not refers to them. And also it's also important to think about accessible ways of using this terminology. We did a lot of work around this and could not find any consensus on a preferred term, but you will find that in this report, we have referred to people from Black Asian and minority ethnicity background, because that is the common terminology. You also find that we are using the term ethnicity degree awarding gap. Some of us who have been in this practice for a long time know that we have had different iterations of that term. I think it was first called differences in degree attainment, and so on and so forth. You've had different kind of uses. So what we always say, or what we are recommending, is that this should be front and center. When we're looking at ethnicity awarding gaps, we should think about the terminologies first. We have found that it really enables us to center the work and understand the peoples that are being referred to. And it's very important for us to think about how people are self-describing themselves within these ethnicities. The second thing that we did, again, to ground the work, was that we thought of critical reflections. This kind of work around, like Umar referenced earlier, has been taking place for a very long time. Over the last 20, 30 years, we've been thinking about differences in awarding gaps, differences in attainment to protected characteristics in the Equality Act. But what we were trying to do was to ensure that we had as many voices and expertise from the area as as possible to enable us to understand the context in which the work was taking place, because we had a lot of APPs to go through, a lot of work to go through, and we needed to really bring our, together expertise from around the sector to enable us to think through the critical lines of inquiry. So we drew upon what we call our expert reference group, and we are so grateful to them from different parts of the country and different kinds of universities. And these people, as you see on the screen, were very helpful in helping us think through the critical issues and challenges that came along our way as we were going and building the typology. You'll probably hear from some of them later, but we just want to again thank them for their work and expertise, and we hope to be that they'll continue to work in this space. So now I would hand over to Jamilia, who will talk a little bit about how we produce the typology. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnola. Hello, everybody. So looking at the methodology behind how we coded the typologies. So it was 249 APPs that we coded using inductive methods, so like a ground up approach from with no preconceived notions of the findings from APPs, and also using a deductive coding, a top down approach. So developing a set of codes from what we have found from the APPs. APPs were coded according to their evaluation strategy, the theory of change, approaches towards addressing the ethnicity awarding gap, including the type of approach, type of change, target groups, clarity of change, the mechanisms of change, and actionality, and whether the interventions were universal or targeted. And then we looked at 15 race equality charter applications. We reviewed these and whether the APPs and the RECs were comparable. However, the RECs were very data driven, with a focus upon staff rather than students, such as staff structures and responsibilities. The methodology and the approaches were also discussed with the ERG as well. And then the findings from this, if we go to the next slide, of the 249 APPs coded, 143 had specific approaches targeting the ethnicity degree awarding gap. So the approaches most identified were developing the curricula, with 37% of all approaches adopting this form of intervention, and using and developing learning analytics was the second most prevalent approach. The approaches least used to target the EDAG were training students as allies and modifying leadership practice and recruiting staff. The approaches were then coded into types of change. These included the 3 Cs, curriculum, culture, and community, with an additional 2 types of changes, which were greater organizational knowledge and student development. Of the 5 general change types, and were the most sought change types, with a sense of community and culture change as the least sought change type. If we go to the next slide on the contextual findings, we see that APPs differed greatly between providers in terms of scope, depth of analysis and description, and articulation of approaches to addressing inequality. The maturity of the interventions were also coded using ratings of high, medium, and low. The maturity of the interventions refers to the extent of which the provider is aiming their intervention at the known gaps. So the interventions coded as low maturity meant that providers were addressing the EDAG by using learning analytics to understand the nature of the EDAG. And then medium maturity refers to interventions broadly targeting known gaps. And high maturity coding referred to interventions designed based on clear understandings of their EDAG. There was a great range of maturity levels in the interventions, and the similarity of approaches between providers was demonstrated, and may also indicate that the higher education providers' tendency to adopt popular approaches undertaken elsewhere is quite common. Findings also revealed that many of the same types of approaches are used to affect different changes, and many different approaches are used to affect the same change type. And many providers adopted an aspirational target of 0% for their EDAG, and this may be due to this being recommended by the OFS guidance. We also looked at the evaluations in TOC and theory of change, encoded these as well. Providers are asked to demonstrate an evaluation within their APPs to show the impacts and observation of their approaches. 25 providers included evaluation strategies with plans to conduct causal evaluations. 44 providers only provided an outline of how they would approach planning their evaluation strategy. 54 providers outlined plans of empirical evidence within their evaluation, and 8 providers involved only narrative standards of evaluation. 18 of the providers did not contain sufficient detail to determine standards of the evidence. Although the nature of the evaluation plans varied across providers, we noted particularly where providers had acknowledged their current levels of knowledge, the limitations and confidence to undertake the evaluations. Of the APPs which included targets for the EDAG, 43 did not include a theory of change. Of the remaining APPs, which included a theory of change, 27 were at an organisational or strategic level. The remaining 28 higher education providers produced theory of changes at the intervention level and included considerations of inputs, outcomes, assumptions, and evaluation strategies. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Sally Andrews now to talk about the stakeholder consultation. Thank you.
The typology which we undertook to understand what providers were planning to do from their access and participation plans to address the ethnicity degree awarding gap. We wanted to speak to people whose roles involved addressing the ethnicity degree awarding gap to find out what their experiences were in this space. So we interviewed 12 participants recruited through a variety of means, from a variety of different organisational roles, from the operational student success officer all the way through to pro-vice chancellors of universities and higher education providers from across England. And as you can see, the majority of our participants were identified their ethnicity as being white British, while 3 of our participants identified as a marginalised ethnicity. So we had 1 participant who was Black British, 1 who was Black African British, and 1 who was British Bangladeshi. And so I think that demonstrates the very white dominated kind of higher education sector that we're working in. And what was really interesting for us is that the more operational roles were where we found our participants who were from marginalised ethnicity backgrounds. So just to kind of bear that in mind as we move forward. And so from doing these interviews, and I have to be so thankful and again so privileged to have been able to speak to these participants who spoke so openly about their experiences, we came up with 6 themes about the experiences of undertaking this work to address the ethnicity degree awarding gap and what participants were telling us about their experiences. The primary and predominant theme for us was about the role of people and really the integral nature of people in being successful in this space. And participants really emphasized the importance of people in being able to do this work. And so from that perspective, the importance of senior leaders and senior leaders being authentic and progressing this work as an authentic priority. There was also a sense of the fact that this work is everybody's responsibility, but really at the same time, we're not quite sure whose responsibility it is in terms of whose objective is it, who's actually doing the day-to-day work. If everyone in the institution, in the provider is responsible for undertaking this work, whose portfolio does it actually fit into? And we can see this with two quotes from our participants. One about senior leaders, where our participant says, how many times is the intervention really to change student outcomes, or how much is it as a marketing tool? Which perhaps reflects a little bit of the skepticism from people in different roles about what that leadership is actually representing, and how those leaders lead really influences the culture of a provider. And from the responsibility, we find someone saying, I'm not even supposed to be in that role anymore, but I still am working my weekends marking papers. And I know what it's like, so it's difficult to say, this is also now your priority, go and do it, when there's not time or budget in there. And so this is really reflecting that kind of balancing of priorities, and the challenge of juggling multiple priorities in this space when it is not your main priority to do this work. But really what came out for us really, really starkly was the role of a couple of key people within providers who were really leading with authentic passion. And these people were seen as really driving the work and the progress of an organization. And there was an idea that if these people left, would that work, would that success continue? The challenge expressed by our participants was that a lot of the time these people who are leading this work are coming up against brick walls. They're really having to push, they're really having to pull people along with them. And the emotional toll and the kind of organizational toll that took is really really evident from what our participants were telling us. And we can see this from participant 2, who says that was championed by one of our academic librarians who did that proactively with no support. Incredibly talented person who genuinely cares about the issues. Rolled that out at the institutional level, had all the flack that you can imagine from reading list conversations. And so we can see that the people who are leading this work with that authentic passion, they're not necessarily in specific roles, but they can be found throughout an institution, throughout a provider. The second theme was about identifying what needed. And we can see from the typology that Jamelia was talking about that a lot of providers are now putting work into developing learning analytics and understanding their organizational context. The challenge that is being faced after that is that people are recognizing the scale of the challenge. They're seeing just how big the ethnicity degree awarding gap is, and are then faced with the starkness of the realization of what the task in front of us is. And that in itself can be quite overwhelming. And we can see that participant 11 said, I think that this is really, really hard, and I no longer see it as a discrete event, which is what I came into it thinking. That I was just going to put together a toolkit, put together a policy for how we look at our reading list, or it was going to be that kind of tick box thing. And I really don't think it is. And so that's that shift from having a box ticking exercise of going, well, if we just do these things, then our problem is solved, we can eradicate inequality, to the realization that actually this is going to be a much bigger task. And that leads us on to our next theme, which is about understanding that addressing inequality is a long-term undertaking, that actually this isn't going to be fixed overnight or in the next year, or even in the next access and participation plan cycle, that it's a long-term undertaking. And our participants were recognizing that actually the challenge with this is that as competing priorities come into play, whether they're organizational priorities, whether they're societal priorities, or whether they're regulator priorities, that the focus on the ethnicity degree awarding gap shifts and becomes a lower priority to be able to accommodate resource on other priorities. And so as we recognise that addressing the ethnicity degree awarding gap is a long-term undertaking, recognising that that means that it needs continued focus. And I can see, we can see that from participant 3, who's saying it's how you then do that in a way that's actually sustained and doesn't get sidelined when the next big political project comes along. And my big worry with this work is that we'll probably see this work becoming slightly lower in the priority list. We also developed a theme around how we integrate evaluation work into this space. And a lot of providers were talking about how when they are doing this work, one of the big challenges, and one of the challenges that we saw from the access and participation plans, is that the organizational skill level in doing evaluation work there's a huge range in abilities, where some providers are very skilled at evaluation, whereas others are less so, and recognize that they're either needing to bring in external consultancy organizations to lead their evaluation, or they need to develop their own skill in doing that, or recruit to those roles. And I think this highlights the challenge in integrating that evaluation work, but also recognizing that actually when we're talking about integrating evaluation work, it's not just about over the next year, because really the being able to observe changes in student degree awards is going to take multiple years, at least 3 to 4 years over a student journey. And so the evaluation work that we're integrating needs to track that longer term focus of this work, which you can see from participant 6, who says what's much harder to demonstrate is whether it is actually making a difference in terms of student outcomes. And that is a piece of work we're trying to do, but has to be quite long term, because it's going to take a few years to see that. And it's a really difficult thing to look at how you can properly analyze that, because it's not like there's an easy control group that you can measure against. We're also finding that providers are starting to recognize the need for tailored responses. And so we talked about toolkits before, and I think toolkits is something that we hear about quite a lot, where people are looking around for what works, and Omar spoke about, what works. And in this space, providers were starting to speak about how what they needed in their organization might be different to what would be needed in another organization, or the resource available to them in their organization is different to the resource available in another organization. And so the need to think about what is actually necessary based on your own cultural readiness for change, but also your student demographic and your staff demographic. And we can see that from participant 11, who says, I was speaking to somebody whose budget was also very different. They were looking at 100K per year. We are a young, small university, and actually the drivers to do this work are also different because of the demographics of the population. We know our students are local, they're immobile, they are largely white, We don't have representation among staff groups, nor necessarily among students. So the co-production bit is kind of more difficult as well. And then finally, one of our most important themes is the importance of centering students. And this starts with earning the trust of our students. We all want to engage students in this work, and we can see from the student consultation aspects of the access and participation plans that universities and providers are recognizing the need to engage students. But actually student voice needs to be centered, and our participants were telling us just how much they thought that the student voice needed to be centered authentically, with students leading and driving the change that they want to see. And the first step of that is earning the trust of our students, which we can see from participant 4, who says fundamental for any project to be successful is a key of building trust with your student partners. Now, trust is earned. You don't just step into that because of the experiences of those students and the microaggressions and difficulties they face on a regular basis. So I think if you want sustained change, you've got to be in it for the long run and accept that you'll only be able to make real change when you've got that trust. So moving on from our findings then, and going back to the typology, one of the aspects that we were focusing on from the typology was to develop a data dashboard that could be more interactive and useful for subsequent knowledge development and interrogation. And so we've developed a dashboard which is embedded onto TASO's website. So if you go to the resource hub and scroll down to the bottom, you can see that we have a data dashboard where you have an option to download the data, which has the provider UK PRN for those who want to link in additional data sets to explore different aspects of the work that providers are suggesting. But we also have a interactive data dashboard where you can look at the types of change that Jamili was talking about, specific changes that are more granular detail of changes that we are exploring. and compare that to the maturity of the approach, the mechanisms of change, the target group, so whether the target group was specific ethnic groups, whether it was aimed at just a generic widening participation student population, whether it wasn't clear. As Jamelia said, there was a range of detail available in this, so for some of them it just wasn't clear who the intervention was targeted at. And we can also see that some figures looking at different types of change and approaches based on the number of students at a provider, the proportion of white students, the type of mission group, and a variety of different categories. We can also look at the type of theory of change and evaluation strategy in there. So please do have a look through that and play with those data and develop the knowledge and understanding and continue the conversation to understand how we can best address the ethnicity degree awarding gap. On that note, I'm going to pass over to Arinola, who's going to talk through some of our recommendations.
Thank you very much, Sally. That is very exciting, and I hope you are able to use that link. And I just want to stress again that it's not a toolkit. This is really about providing people with some kind of resource to look at what other people have been doing and probably draw some inspiration from those providers in the sector. So we came up with 5 key recommendations. Again, contextualizing the form that we're not looking at the toolkit. So these are not things that you have to do at all. For me, it was very important because I remember coming up with recommendations about 12 years ago about what people should do in the sector. And what is really heartening is that in the 12 years since, we have started arguing about whether there is a degree awarding. So things have really moved on quite a bit, and now there's much more understanding of what is happening within the sector. And our first recommendation really speaks to that. We're focusing on more robust evaluation plans, because what we are seeing is that even though it's important, it's now more there's more understanding about the ethnicity degree awarding gap. Evaluation plans are really, there's a range of different evaluation plans, and we didn't find many robust evaluation plans, especially those that were underpinned with theories of change within the APPs. And what we really mean about that is that there are so many different providers. It would be really difficult to say that what works in a bustling city in the middle of the West Midlands would work in the outer Hebrides. They're just different places, different institutions, different communities, and it's very important for institutions to contextualize their own provision, contextualize the kind of experiences that their students were having, and put this into what they were thinking about the degree awarding gap. Otherwise, it was basically just copy and paste, and that we're not sure that would be very robust. The second thing for us was looking at what Sally mentioned earlier about those key people, the champions, and those people have existed through the last 20, 30 years who have driven this work. And it's important that those people are recognized and supported. Where those people are not, you'll find that it was very clear from the APPs that it was difficult to sustain the evidence base behind what they were producing, because the person who probably was driving a lot of the work was not the person that was writing it, or the person that was able to speak to it was no longer at the institution. And many of our discussions with providers or people in the reference group spoke about that, about how institutions basically were relying on a couple or 3 or 4 people at the grassroots that were driving work around the ethnicity awarding gap. It needed to be prioritized a bit more. And the third thing was really speaking to how the data was used. It's good to see how learner analytics is used a lot more, but it felt like a lot of people were just using data and thinking about how they could find more data. And no matter how you stare at the water, it's not going to change many things in it really. we needed to use the data to inform action, because action obviously speaks a lot more than the data itself. And that driver about moving from understanding the gap to actual interventions is what is more likely to change things in terms of the percentages we have seen and the gap we have seen. Fourth, and I think this is another thing that is very, very important, is around the ethics of including students in addressing the ethnicity awarding gap. There needs to be a lot more consideration for how students are being involved. Students are a fantastic resource. We have particularly have enjoyed having Jamelia with us and understanding that, you know, that viewpoint. But on the other hand, sometimes the students feel as if nothing was what was happening, and sometimes they felt even more damaged by the entire process if the ethos and the culture was not about protecting them. One of my friends who's also a student just referenced this as not a safe place, but a grave place, a place where things went to die. And this is actually not very useful for the sector, and acknowledging that the conversation around ethnicity awarding gap is difficult, is challenging, is actually a very important step in addressing this. Nobody's saying that it's easy. Nobody's saying that it's going to happen overnight, and actually it's quite difficult for students, for staff, for management, for grassroots people. The conversations around these things are complex, wicked issues. That's why we're still addressing it 20, 30 years down the line. And finally, we also talked about how it was very important for institutions to go for those big leaps, to really think about how they could embrace this discomfort. What we're really speaking to here is about how institutions were happy to think about their growth, to think about how they could really, you know, get to what the OFS has said was the target of eliminating the attainment gap or the degree awarding gap. To do this, it requires bold vision and persistent and consistent work around the evaluation, around the champions, around using the data, and around ensuring that everybody in the space is cared for, and there were robust boundaries that enabled the institution to actually support people, because actually it is really fundamentally about the student experience. So those were our own recommendations. We'll talk about this a bit more, hopefully, in the future. And we just want to say a big thank you once again to TASO for giving us the opportunity to have this work, and we hope to speak to you a bit more about it in the Q&A. Thank you. Handing over back to Omar.
Thank you, Arinola and Sally and Jamelia. And just to explain, Jamelia, I'm sorry we had to turn off your video at one point because your sound was a bit interfered with, and we may have to do that again, but right now it sounds fine. So we now have a time for a panel discussion. I hope you'll agree that those findings were extremely compelling and important. I hope you used a chance to look at the data dashboard, and that you also follow up on the recommendations. Turning to the panel first, though, I thought we'd ask Ada the first question, bringing in her reflections based on your position at Wolverhampton University. And I wondered, you know, what your reflections were as someone who's been working on this as a senior leader in a higher education institution on these findings, particularly in regard to these range of approaches being delivered, and the fact that there was so much similarity between providers and what they were undertaking, which kind of suggested a lack of context-specific intervention. So, or any other observations you've got, Ada, but I thought I'd kick it off with you and then turn to Jamelia next.
Thanks, Omar, and thanks for that presentation. That's quite interesting and enlightening. Yeah, in relation to your question about the range of approaches highlighted in the report, you have things like developing the curricula. There was also the issue around using and developing learner analytics, recruiting staff development, adapting assessment practices. All of those are quite logical in the context of the issues we are discussing. I don't think any of those approaches are out of place to try to address this issue. But I think other considerations need to come into play. Are we simply importing approaches from one context to another without really reflecting on the extent to which the evidence in our own context backs that particular approach is something we need to consider. I know there's a lot around decolonizing the curriculum, isn't there? And two of the most common approaches here are that around reforming the curriculum and the learner analytics. But it's that contextual knowledge that we need to reflect on. To what extent is it useful for my own group of students? I think that's important. And also, to what extent is the culture enabling that particular approach to flourish and to succeed? So that needs to some consideration as well. And also, to what extent are students involved in those conversations? A lot of times we talk about co-production, but how genuine is that? Do we just put things in front of our students to endorse? For me, that's consultation. That really isn't genuine co-production. So we need to look at that, the extent to which our students are involved in those conversations in terms of those approaches we're trying to embed within our own context. So if things are not working, it's not because some of those approaches are not useful. We probably need to look at the process as well. How are we embedding them? How are we monitoring those approaches that we import from elsewhere? So that's my thought regarding that. I don't think any of the highlighted approaches shouldn't be there. They all make sense, but it's how they are being enacted meaningfully that we really need to reflect on.
I'm going to pick up something you said there. I mean, there's a lot I want to pick up, but something specific to direct to Jamelia, which is, the importance of involving students, which is also one of the key recommendations. I was curious, you aren't just a student, you're someone who was a researcher on this project. How did your learnings from working on the project and the project findings align with your experience as a current university student?
Yeah, so within the APPs, we saw some interventions which had good intentions, but with no theory of change or causal impact evident in the evaluation. As a student, I've attended interventions that have had every good intention, and I've worked with lecturers and tutors who seem to have the passion and the drive to make that change. But some interventions implemented appear to resemble some of those approaches found in the APPs. I've been to meetings and taken part in interventions which they have a lack of resources, and they haven't thought about short, medium, and long-term objectives, such as threads, which have been started and then left untouched. Or approaches which have been initiated and then not continued for no known reason. But this being said, I think that some lecturers go above and beyond. Without these lecturers, I wouldn't even be here, because I came about on this project as a referral from my lecturer. So along with other lecturers that have been very open about the gaps and how they want to change that, and having mentors that have supported me every step of the way, even when I've lacked confidence myself. And I think this echoes that there is a passion from specific people. Are these members of staff getting the recognition and the support they deserve? I don't know, but I think that seeing interventions with great intent and passion, but not executed perhaps how they should have been due to a lack of resources and time and support, I think that really does echo what we've seen in the APPs. Thank you for the question, Omar.
Yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of students will, and a lot of, I suppose, academics and other university administrators will recognize what you say there. And Ada, I was wondering about that important point that Jamelia has made, that, it's key people are committed to and do even understand the need to address this. And they are definitely personally committed to addressing the gap, but also would probably like more resource to better evaluate and affect change. But there's an issue both around their support and their resourcing while they're in the institution, but also around them leaving an institution. And how then do we either support those key people while they're in the institution, but also when that knowledge, it could be down to one or two key staff, how best can organizations address the fact that, you know, when a key member of staff like that leaves, there's a danger of knowledge being lost, momentum being lost. What are your observations and reflections on how we try to mitigate against that?
I think it's been anticipatory, isn't it? We know that you cannot let all the knowledge be in one or two people. I think that's pretty dangerous, because change always happens. Even it doesn't matter how well you like or you enjoy your job. If a better opportunity comes up, people
Yes.
will move. And so not to anticipate that, I think it's a bit short-sighted. And while you may have key people leading this area of work, because I think you need that as well, because everybody's job is nobody's job. So I worry where there isn't anybody in an institution who has that overall responsibility for that area of work. So that's important, or some key people as well. But you need to make sure that that knowledge is shared and that responsibility is shared. We say in my university, inclusivity is everybody's responsibility. In our schools, we have about 15 schools, and each school has a school inclusivity lead. So you have that knowledge spread across the school to embed an inclusive framework. 15 people are not going to all live in one day. So in a sense, when you do that, but then it does involve resources as well, because they have hours on their workload to do that work. And where we are moving towards now is making sure that we have clear objectives for all academics. So if you are a module leader, a program leader, you will have objectives around improving student outcomes. So in that way, it's not just the responsibility doesn't rest on one person's shoulder, because it just won't work if you want that whole organizational approach. So I think we need to be anticipatory there to know that people do leave with the best of intentions, but we need to make sure that that knowledge is well embedded across the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully endorse that response. I'm going to turn to the project team, Sally and Arinola probably first, but also Jamila, if you want to chip into this question. I mean, compared to your preconceptions coming into this project, maybe especially you, Arinola, you've worked on it for over a decade. Were there any aspects of the experience or findings that were surprising to you, given, you know, what you found and what you've known and learned over the many years of researching and working on this issue?
Yeah, thank you, Omar. I think, again, just from a very positive experience, I would say that when I first experienced a non-inclusive curricula, I didn't have the words to express it. I remember going to my lecturer and saying, I'm not sure this applies to me, but I would not have used the terminologies that we are bouncing around today: inclusivity, diversity, the epistemology, diverse epistemologies. All of these things are now mainstream. I think that it was fantastic to see some of these terminologies in the APPs, to see that this was more mainstream. And I remember, for me that was just a great experience, because you come to a little bit of cynicism, because obviously we still have the same percentages in terms of awarding gaps. We still have some of the same problems, but I think I was very pleased to see the attitudes that institutions were taking with respect to this ethnicity awarding gap useful. And one of the things that we also saw was that not some, obviously the APPs also cover other protected characteristics, and I've also worked with disabilities and other things, and it was also good to see that institutions were thinking about this. So thinking about the student journey, thinking about the student experience from, you know, through the entire institution was really good. That institutions are taking a little bit more responsibility, or at least I'm not sure whether they're taking responsibility or being forced, obliged to take responsibility, thinking of the OFS target about this, and I think that is forcing it to the front. So that was good to see, basically.
Yeah, we've got just, I'll come to you in a sec, Sally. I just want to note that there are questions. We are going to be coming to those in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So please do continue. Don't give up on your questions. We'll have 20 minutes to address them by the panel. So, what Arinola just raised, the issue of targets, is actually one of the questions that we'll pick up. But was there anything from Sally or Jamila about anything surprising or interesting from the findings that maybe not contrary to, but that you weren't anticipating when you started this work?
It's okay, Sally, you go first.
Okay, so I think it wasn't surprising, but I think it hit me most starkly, and something that I hadn't thought about previously, is the potential for harm to be caused to our students through the very act of trying to do this work. So that I think one of the things for me, the kind of realization for me was when we do this work is not just thinking about what impact we want to have, but what is the potential harm that can be done to students. So the re-traumatizing that can happen every time that we ask our students to tell us about times that they faced discrimination or harassment in itself is potentially damaging to students who are asked this time and time again. But to then face that alongside what they then perceive as tokenism, to take that experience that they've told us and opened up to us and to not act on it, or at least not for students not to see us acting on it, whether or not we do, is again, it's harmful to students, but it's also really harmful to our relationship with our students. And going back to that, earning that trust is just furthering that distance between our students and us. And so I think, again, not surprising, but I think opened my eyes to something that I'd not previously considered, is this importance of understanding the work that we're trying to do from the students' perspectives, from their eyes.
And Jamelia?
Yeah, I completely agree with Sally about it opened my eyes to, and it's something that I didn't even consider, the risk that was behind some of these interventions. And yeah, it was quite surprising. And I was also surprised about how similar a lot of the APPs were, despite different university context and makeup. The approaches seemed all very similar. What differed was more the planning around approaches, the theory of change, and evaluation, more than the approaches themselves, which is why we saw such a large number of like curriculum change and learning analytics, because it seemed that a lot of providers were doing similar things. So yeah, that was quite a surprise to me. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask one more question before I turn to the Q&A, because some great questions in there that were also things we would plan to discuss as a panel. But one of the key recommendations or kind of threads throughout the report is that we need bottom-up as well as top-down approaches to this. And I thought I'd ask all of you that question, your reflections on that, but also, do you have any actual practical examples of what a kind of combined approach that combines both, say, top-down, so staff training policy from leadership or something like that, and bottom-up, say, students organizing amongst themselves to ensure that an event for, say, Black History Month goes ahead, or other pressures that students put on lecturers or on university administrators to address the gap. So I thought I'd start with you, Ada, because you're probably most familiar in working, at the intersection of both top-down and bottom-up approaches.
Yeah. Well, you just mentioned the Black History Month. I think here we have examples where our student union is very involved in a lot of this work, and we have a problem with the Black History Month, actually, because I'm Black not just 1 month, I'm Black for life, kind of thing. So it's something we need to come back to all the time. And our student union is very active in that, holding those events, and us making sure we find ways of making sure that those events link to what we do in the classroom, link to the curriculum, and link to other activities as well. So it's not just lost when we have a Black History Month. And the student union in our university has carried out several campaigns over the course of the years. There's one that was titled Believe, Belong, and Achieve. And it was really the students coming together to share their lived and living experiences as we use the term global majority. So we haven't used them for some time now. So as global majority students, and making sure we understand where they are coming from, and also the issues that they face on a day-to-day basis, as a way of reducing that prejudice. We've run things like an academic integrity campaign. We, meaning our students union, has run that, because what we find is that we have a high incidence of academic misconduct with some of our international students. And we don't think it's always down to people wanting to cheat. We think we need to look at what we offer as well, the extent to which they find it relatable, the extent to which we recognize the degree of cultural shock when students come here, digital shock, all of those things. And if you look at issues like mental health and well-being, for instance, a lot of our services are largely traditional and Eurocentric. So to what extent does oppression manifest itself in mental health? So having all of those conversations with our students, from our students, does help us. And of course, you have the top-down approach as well, where I talked about having academic objectives for all academics to make sure they have a responsibility to close that gap. So we have those objectives clearly when we come to do appraisals, and those objectives will be monitored going forward. So everybody recognizes it's their responsibility to do that. And that those conversations will happen, not just at the end of the year when you come to have your appraisal, but it's an ongoing conversation throughout the year. I remember years ago when I had my own teaching group, one of the things my line manager used to do was to discuss my students' appraisal of my students' evaluation of my module. And think how powerful that will be if I know at the end of the year, I'm going to have that conversation with my line manager. What are my students saying about me? Not just what I'm feeding back to her. So I think those top-down approaches are important, combined, not just one.
Thank you. Well, any of the project team want to, because you're the people who kind of foregrounded this top-down and bottom-up together. Maybe I'll start with you, Arinola.
Oh, I completely agree with what Ada has said. I think one of the key issues is what our lens, because the way we are seeing, ethnicity development always differs. I think it's very important to have as many different angles of understanding the ethnicity awarding gap around the table as possible. It's like fresh avocado, isn't it? Is it fresh or is it fresh? What do you really mean, and what are the things that people are understanding, and how is it affecting them? So ongoing conversations, I think, are so important with as many people around the table as possible.
To Sally and Jamelia, if not, we can turn to, we do have 17 questions, but I want to give you a chance to elaborate further, because I think this is a really key part of the report, and where TASO is really keen to try to build on that finding.
Going back to what Ada was saying about the kind of the whole institutional approach, I can't remember if that was just now or in our meeting earlier, but having that whole institutional approach to doing this work, I think that having that organizational level strategy that does incorporate everybody into that lens from a top-down perspective is really important. But then from a bottom-up perspective, it's about not necessarily having a clear idea of what change you want to see and what you want specific people to do, but rather facilitating and enabling resourcing where people are engaging in pockets of activity. So not trying to steer the direction of the bottom-up approaches, but just facilitating them to happen. I think that's for me where the top-down and the bottom-up come together here.
Jamelia, do you have any thoughts?
We'll move on to the questions if you want to, Omar, because I know there's quite a lot.
No, because I think as well, bottom up, often the way that's framed is in terms of students putting pressure, but obviously that's a particular way of thinking about students. And obviously we want to make sure that you're influencing the top, and also there are other forms of maybe grassroots or community activities that can play a role. So I was just curious how you see this, how you feel you've participated in those kinds of activities, and maybe what's worked from your perspective.
I feel that a lot of I've participated in a lot of grassroots activities, and to be honest, when I first started my undergraduate degree, I didn't even know that there was an ethnicity awarding gap, and why I didn't know that I don't know. It's not something. It's not an obvious thing when you apply for university. And we didn't have any of the uncomfortable conversations, or we were just taught the material, and that was it. I look back on that now from the perspective I am now, and I think that that was crazy because, you know, why aren't we're asking students to defy the odds, but we're not telling them what the odds are. So yeah, that really resonated with me. You know, just as simple as having those uncomfortable conversations. Now I'm an MSc student, and now we do have those uncomfortable conversations, but I didn't at undergraduate level. I'm not too sure why, but all of a sudden now I'm an MSc student, there's lecturers having these conversations, and it makes a huge difference. It's inspiring to know that lecturers believe in you and are rooting for you, and you know, they don't think you're going to hear this and think, oh gosh, well, I better not even try then, you know, and feel defeated. It's not about that. It's about knowing that the cards are stacked against you and blowing them over, and you've defied the odds anyway by being there, by being a student at that university. I was the first person of my family to go to university, and I'm proud of just that alone, without anything else. So I think it's having a bit more faith in students. But yeah, thank you for the question.
No, that was really deeply inspiring, and also a reminder of why we do this work and why it matters. There are people behind the numbers. Every inequality, you know, every percentage point has a person there, and tens of thousands. So it's great to have you on the call and to remind us of that. So I'm going to move now, though, to the questions and answers. And there's a few questions of clarification for the research project. But building on what Jamilia's just said, her comment that she wasn't aware, your comment when you started that as an undergraduate, of the ethnicity degree awarding gap. And while I think, Arinola, I agree with you that there's greater understanding and awareness, I suppose it's not true to say that there's universal understanding and awareness of the gap. And obviously, if it applies to all lectures and all courses, we kind of need universal understanding. And there's a question here from Penny Ding, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly, which I think gets to the heart of this, which is, what can we do to raise more awareness among academics of the closing degree awarding gap agenda and what works? As a representative for racialized students at my student union, I've been approached by so many staff members about all things related to this, and usually the way they frame their questions tend to sound like they know nothing about the challenges faced by racialized students and want me to spell it out for them. So having said that there's a lot of awareness, I guess is a challenge for you, Arinola, a bit kind of puncturing your optimism there. There's still some work to be done, and how do we do that work to raise that awareness?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, and I think it does feel a little bit frustrating when you hear people asking the question again and again and again. But I think that this is one of the reasons why you commissioned this, because the typology just does this for you. If you look at the link that Sally shared a while ago, it will really help people to see how things are different, similar, you know. It basically gives you a good map of how the APPs are written. I also think that there are a lot of conversations that are taking place, not just in the sector, but also in society around inequalities. And sometimes I think people are aware, but there are other things that are making it difficult for them to, I don't want to say comprehend, but come to terms with the fact that the ethnicity degree awarding gap is the biggest gap of all the gaps. You understand? It's just a little bit difficult. So there would always be gaps, isn't it? This, when you talk about the normalization curve, there would always be, you know, very, you know, high achievers who are, you know, Asian or Chinese or African Caribbean. All of those things will be there. But it's an understanding of the overall picture. And I think this is why this topology is so important, because we have to put these things into context, not looking at exceptions. And I think that's what we need to look at, to enable people to think about context, not just the guy I know across the street. That person's fantastic. I'm not saying that the experience is not valid. It is. So what we're saying is that, but within context, you know, X, Y, Z happens, and those kind of things probably is about moving people towards, you know, reports like this and typologies like this that would help people to see more of a helicopter view rather than, you know, one person that they want to use as a cherry picking. start.
Thank you. And how about you, Ed? I mean, obviously you work with academics across departments and disciplines, so and with various levels of awareness and knowledge of this issue.
I think it's a responsibility, isn't it? I mean, talking about things being driven top bottom and bottom up, I think this is one where leadership has a responsibility to make sure that the knowledge is widely known within the institution. And I always say it's not, we mustn't always feel we need to do work like this because it's an external imperative. I mean, in our university, we say we are the University of Opportunity. What exactly does it mean? Why widening participation university? Social justice is central to our mission. So this kind of inequality is not acceptable for that kind of context. So it's really framing it within the context of the values of higher education, the values of the organization, and making sure that people understand what those values mean in practical terms. Otherwise, it becomes a University of Opportunity, a strap line, isn't it? So what does that mean in practice? It means that this is unacceptable to have gaps like this, be it in terms of ethnicity or in terms of working class students or those from disadvantaged areas. So I think framing it within the context of who we are is quite important to make people understand the importance of what we're trying to do, trying to transform lives, and not some instrumental action that we're taking because the OFS is saying we need to do this. For me, I think that is important. It's about the data, but it's about hearts and minds as well. Why do we come into this job? To make a difference for everybody.
Yes, yes, thank you. And thank you for that reminder. And that one of the questions sort of flags that, saying that there's a basic duty to ensure social justice. And so, as long as we don't tackle that there's an argument from Donovan asks that universities may be failing in that duty until they to ensure social justice for their students. There's a question. Oh, I see Sarah, our project lead, is answering the one a specific question. I did actually want to follow up on Edda's point there on the OFS target, which was a big part of the finding. Probably understandably, almost all or most of the APPs did reference the target to reduce the gap, the black-white unexplained gap by 2024-25, which is obviously next year. And it's obviously unlikely that that target is now going to be hit. And from my interpretation of your report is there was a somewhat mechanical reference to that target often. But at the same time, perhaps that target is one of the factors that has raised this up the agenda. So I thought maybe a bit of reflection on the role of the regulator, the Office for Students, and ensuring that this is an important issue, but also the limits maybe of a kind of approach that focuses on targets only, and any observations on, you know, your thoughts on how we can improve on that, so that we see better outcomes, even if we're not going to hit that target in 2024-25. We certainly do want to hit that target eventually, right? And so how are we going to get there? And what is the role of the regulator in doing so if targets aren't driving it? Maybe I'll start with you, Arinola, and then you, Sally, and then you, Ada, and all of you.
So I think that it's because the target set by the OFS has helped in many ways to put this on the agenda. Is that where we would have loved to be? Probably not. We would have loved to see people taking it on, like Ada said, from a humanized perspective, looking at the students and saying, I want the very best for you. I want your experience to be, you know, top notch at University X. That would have been the best. But like we saw in the report, is that so many things are happening at the same time. And we completely understand, you know, we are in a social cultural environment, political environment, economic environment that is affecting so many of our students. And it's as if it's like tumbleweed, isn't it? It's whatever happens first that is most important. But I think what we were saying is about, if we look at our students first and foremost as humans who are going to change the world, because all of our universities have something of that sort, that you are, you know, the best X, and we would help you to put you on the path of, you know, doing whatever in the world. If we still have students like that, if you were doing it to a robot. If our students were bots, what would we do to them? You ensure that they have every single thing, within that bot, because you could do that. But and it will be mechanical. But our students are much more complex than bots, and we have to find ways of putting the same thing, every element that they need, but with in their own particular experiences, with their own particular idiosyncrasies, and ensure that they are still the best, best human that you are allowing to go out in the world, and so that they can continue to be, lifelong learners. And I think that idea of inspiring confidence is probably at the key of that, and ensuring that we are letting our students know that we believe in them. So even beyond, and I think there are other questions in the chat around that, even beyond the ethnicity awarding gap, you do this to all students. You actually change the world, because that is what we want to do. That's what we want to achieve. We want to be able to ensure that humans are flourishing.
Maybe Sally, and then I'll come back to Etta on this question.
Target, I think, is there's a couple of different sides to it, and I think that if we didn't have a target, which obviously we're moving to with the new EOR, but hopefully there's different drivers there. I think that provides a pressure for providers to kind of form a catalyst for doing this work, and so I think that's something that's really important to recognize. And as Jamelia and I were looking at the access and participation plans, there were even then, when the narrative was about aiming for 0, there were still providers who were saying, well, our ethnicity degree awarding gap is better than the sector average, so we're all good right now. And so kind of thinking about what is going to contextualize what the sector sees as being necessary and is what we're driving to, is, I think, really important. Now, in terms of part of your question was about what is the role of the regulator here, and I think that for us in a lot of our conversations formed a big part of this. So and I think that we talked about authenticity and tokenism, and I think that where you have a numerical target, there is a desire there to do. One of our participants described the access and participation plans as performative, because they're not actually realistic documents. They are something that is there to appease the regulator. And so I think when we're thinking about this work, what we have to do is focus on realism, what is feasible. And I think that having providers focus on realistic theory of changes, so what are the mechanisms of how these interventions are actually going to lead to change? How are you going to make sure that you continue to focus on this work when stuff hits the fan and student recruitment is a real challenge, and your staff are leaving because they're overworked, all of the different pressures that we know the sector is facing? What are you going to do to continue to prioritize this as a focus and continue to make sure that this is being worked on and progressed? And I think that there's a balance there, and I don't have the answers, and I don't envy John Blake in his role, but I think making sure that they're or trying to do whatever we can to make sure that the work that is happening, that we celebrate the intention and the authenticity of approaches rather than the performative, big targets, optimistic, aspirational, jazz hands of, we're doing a shiny new intervention. I think focusing on what has the potential to work and focus on regulation that celebrates the focus of what has the potential to work is a key thing for us.
Okay, Etta, I'm going to move on after your answer to this, but do you have any observations?
I think a lot has been said about this, isn't it? It does give the momentum, definitely, but we need to reflect on the impact of when unrealistic targets are not met and the frustration that it does cause when that doesn't happen. And Sally has used the words realistic. Yes, it's got to be realistic, isn't it? And more importantly, it's got to be sustainable. One of the things, analogies that was given in the report is that of a quick fix diet so you can wear your swimsuit in the summer or a long-lasting sustained diet because you want to lead a healthy life. One takes longer than the other. Which do you want? One is more sustainable, one is more beneficial than the other. So when you come with these unrealistic targets, that's what you have. And we need to look at the backdrop against which we are expecting these things to happen, with the cost of living crisis, with the strikes, 18 days in March. Tutors, lecturers are human beings. They are having to deal with all of this and having this responsibility to close the gaps as well. Shortage of resources as well. So we need to be realistic if we want these targets to be met and reduce that level of frustration. Do we really want changes to happen, or do we just want a figure? I think that's the question the regulator needs to ask. If we want changes to happen, they need to sit back and reflect on what those targets look like.
So I'm going to try to get to two more questions before we wrap up. I'm apologizing in advance. I knew that we wouldn't get to all of your excellent questions, and we'll try to answer those that we can by email afterwards. There's a question, I think, directed at you, Jamilia, around supporting, encouraging, and mentoring as an important area. They're working, Lancaster is working on progression of WP students from undergraduate to postgraduate. And do you have any ideas about how to have a proactive approach for undergraduates like yourself, who might not, have initially thought about doing postgraduate research, but ended up doing so, in the role of, say, encouragement, support, or mentoring?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So again, I think this goes down to having conversations and communication. I think as well in the APPs, and I've seen it in interventions that I've taken part of, the turnout is never great. It's never what lecturers want, and I think that we shouldn't really see that as disengagement. We shouldn't see absence as disengagement. We should actually see it as, let's try again. Let's have this conversation again. Let's revisit this another time. Because I mean, on my undergraduate degree, I was working night shifts. I had children, and I couldn't always make the 11 o'clock meeting that was happening. And on a Wednesday. So I think it's important to make yourselves accessible, approachable, have conversations. And I think that is inspiring enough. Just the fact that, I remember being approached for, do you have plans to go on the MSc? Or, I've had people ask me about a PhD, and I think that alone is inspiring enough. The thought that people actually think you could do that. I always talk about pressure, and it's, I saw on Staff's Uni Facebook page actually how pressure can be a privilege, and I think that it means someone's relying on you, someone thinks you can do it. So I think that alone is such a huge thing. Thank you.
Yeah. This is a question for the research team, and I think it sort of spurs a wider point as well, especially in the sort of observation that looking at the APPs, there was a drag and drop approach, and there was a limited number of interventions. There's a question is, did you notice any difference in institutions who have a very diverse student body compared to those who have relatively few students from ethnic minority backgrounds? And it's, you might expect that there would be a different approach, or a more mature or robust approach. There were some questions also in the audience for Sally and Aranola about what you meant by robust or mature in this context, or for you, Jamilia. But did you notice, were there any differences in the research? Yeah.
No. And that in itself was, I think, really interesting for us, that there wasn't any difference in approaches or types of change or mechanisms dependent on mission group or number of students or diversity of student body, or anything else that we looked at, or maturity or robustness of approach. It really depended provider to provider, and it's not even like one provider who had a really good I don't know, evaluation strategy, therefore had really robust interventions. It wasn't that there was one provider who was excellent across the board. It was that pockets were, you know, had really nuanced ideas of doing things that others didn't. And I think that part of this comes down to the fact that none of us know how to do this. None of us know what works. So we're all desperately looking around at everyone else and picking up ideas from what we see other people as doing. And so there isn't any, that kind of provider specific context that we were talking about in the report is a very new and emerging thing where providers are going, oh, actually, we do need to think about what we need in our specific provider, because I think up till now it's been very much, do you know what works? Can we learn from what works from you? And rather than going, okay, well, what do we need right now? How do, not just what do we need, but how do we do that within our own organization? What will work and how do we need to underpin that? As we found from the previous TASO reports, it's not just about the intervention itself, but how it's implemented. And I think that probably that's driving the fact that we didn't find any differences between the different providers.
So on that note, I'm going to ask Alicia, my colleague, to share that question that we asked you at the beginning. And actually, if we can scroll down to question 2, because I think the first one sort of indicates that some of you are already started your APPs and the rest of you probably are not working on that in that role. But the second question was around, to what extent do you agree that your institution or provider is designing interventions to successfully address the degree awarding gap? I'd say, you know, if you look at it, the balance is towards agree. So 41% somewhat agree and 21% strongly agree, meaning 62% agree. Although that still means that 20% of you disagree. So a fifth of providers don't think, of people on this call today don't think their institution is developing effective interventions, and about another fifth neither agree nor disagree. So that's quite a mixed fit finding. And even of the agrees, more of you somewhat than strongly agree. So I think, you know, you can see, I suppose, in the response to that poll question, I'm going to close that now. I suppose, that, you know, the researchers on the team here might be feeling that aligns quite nicely with our findings. I'm going to give Ada just one last word if you have any other further observations, and I'm going to have to conclude because we're running out of time. And particularly on this question of an institutional approach, one big question that comes through across the other questions that I haven't been able to ask, apologies, is, you know, the need for this to be a cross-institutional approach. There's an observation there that it's not surprising perhaps that a curriculum-led approach would only be part of the solution. That's just one cog in the wheel. So what does that look like? Not just bottom up, but institutional.
Well, I think we tend to talk about constructive alignment in terms of teaching in the classroom. What we don't do very well is look at that at an institutional level. In other words, we're trying to close the gaps. So to what extent do all our activities and our operations align with that particular aspiration? So you have so many things happening. You have the curriculum, you have processes, validation processes and all of that. Do they align? In my university, we have a teaching observation scheme. Does it align? We have the peer review scheme. Does it align? Do our mental health services align? Our disability support services, because there's the whole issue of intersectionality we haven't had the time to talk about. Do they all align? Yeah. And there's also the big one for me. Anybody who knows me, this is a big one: representation. Representation. Do our students see themselves in our academic body, in our senior management teams? They don't. It's still a big issue there. So that aspiration isn't there because they are not seeing people like them. We're talking about role models, but this is 2023. Go to the universities, walk into any university executive and look around the table. Most of the time, it's all white. So who's aspiring? Who is encouraging these students to believe that they can be what we want them to be? So I think we're making the jobs harder for ourselves if we don't look at all of these areas. Yeah. One of the things the report highlighted is that there isn't a silver bullet. It's all of those things. We just don't need one approach. It's looking at everything across the institution and make sure that they all align.
That's a great place to end. And I also do want to say that while I do agree that there's a long way to go, this was a very inspirational talk. I thought our speakers were excellent. I learned a lot from all of you, Jamelia, Arinola, Sally, and Etta, and I want to thank you all for the work that you've done on this excellent report and your contributions today. As I've highlighted, we are after your feedback, so please do keep an eye out for the post-event survey in your inboxes. We also have other upcoming events. Please do also look out for that. Perhaps most importantly, following on from the recommendations of this report, TASO will be issuing further invitations to tender to work with providers on developing those more robust theories of change so that we can look at how far the interventions that you're implementing on the ground, now that we know the kinds of things that are being implemented, how far we can develop intermediate and longer term outcome measures so that we can be confident of the mechanism through which that intervention actually impacts on the degree awarding app, so that in 5 years' time, we're not talking about, that gap is moving in the direction that we want to see, and that target is not merely aspirational, one that we can actually see ourselves hitting. But as a way of goodbye, I'd just like to say thanks again to all of our participants. Again, look out for our future research. Please do look at the report itself, ask TASO or the authors any further questions, and thank you for your participation today.